Welcome to the finish line with Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and on the finish line, we're working on getting our quilt tops quilted, bound, and done. A couple of weeks ago, I did make a very simple table runner, and I'll put a link in the description if you'd like to make the table runner. But today, we're going to get this quilted, trimmed, and bound. And we're going to do it on our home machine with the feed dogs up. This table runner was made with a series of strip sets and squares. There's no set in squares, no diamonds, no half square triangles. It was all sewn with straight lines. We do have some irregular shaped borders. Those borders are going to be trimmed off after the quilting is done. We could have trimmed those off first, but by trimming them, we would have had all these seams being bias seams, which means the quilt would have been stretchy and unstable. But by leaving these points as we quilt, it's going to stabilize it, and they will be able to be trimmed off after. So we have the top of the quilt done, the batting is throughout the whole thing, and the background just covers the entire section. To quilt this, I'm going to do straight line stitching, which means I can leave my feed dogs up. I can use a walking foot, but I can also use other sewing machine feet. But what is important is that this is very well basted together. Because the feed dogs are going to be up, they're going to want to grab the back of the fabric. So I want to make sure that it's very well basted. And in this case, I'm going to be using a fusible batting. This is a Hobbs Heirloom fusible batting. It is a cotton polyester batting. It's considered an 80-20. 80% cotton, 20% polyester. There's a fusible glue on each side. So that glue holds those layers together. So I do not have to do any pin basting, hand basting. I just lay my 3 layers together and I put that iron up and down and fuse those layers together. Turn it to the back side and repeat. Now that those pieces are together, I'm going to be able to just bring it to the machine, and the top and the bottom are going to pull in under the machine at the same time. If you have a walking foot, you can use it, but there are some other feet that we can use for the straight line quilting. I will not be marking the quilt, but I do want to use the edge of the foot as my marking guide. I'm going to have the edge of the foot follow the edge of all of my blocks. I'm going to go in one direction, go in the other direction. So I'm going to be doing all of the directions. So what I'm looking for in a foot is that I have an equal measurement from the center to this side and the center to the other side. And that way, if I want to use it in one direction and in the other direction, my stitches are going to be the same. I'm going to be using a polyester thread from Dash, and the thread is called Primo Soft. It's 100% polyester. However, it looks like cotton. So I get the strength of the polyester, the no lint of the polyester, but the look of a cotton. And I'm going to have that in the bobbin and in the top. I do have my feed dogs up and my thread is ready to go. I'm just using a straight stitch, but I'm going to change the length so it's larger. So instead of a 2.5, I'm going to use a 3.5. I'm going to be able to follow the edge with the foot. But as I come to some areas, there will not be markings, so I need to mark those. So I'm just going to continue that straight line right off the edge. And I'm going to do that in all of the directions. Now I've used something very dark, but you'll be able to use something that you can see. So where there is no seam, you're just going to draw a pretend one. And they're just in line with the regular seams. Once those imaginary seam lines are drawn, I'm going to be able to stitch. I'm going to start off the fabric, stitch on the fabric, following that edge. We need to just make sure that the quilt is not being pulled down on our lap, so we can lift it up and let the feed dogs do all the work. And just stitch following the edge of the foot to the edge of the seam line. And I'm going to do the entire seam from one side all the way to the other. And I'm going to be able to stitch right onto the batting. Because the foot has equal sides from the center, I'm going to be able to stitch this second line. I won't have to twist the quilt to try to find that edge. I'm going to use the left-hand side. Starting on the batting, I'm going to follow my drawn seam line and then continue going all the way down. And just guide that fabric along the edge. And when you come to the end, just stitch right off. I will be stitching on both sides of each seam, going in one direction and going in the other. We now have this beautiful double stitching line on each side of the seam. And if we happen to go off a little bit, no one will notice. And the back side has that beautiful little checkered pattern. When all of the quilting is done, we're going to be able to trim off these irregular points. But before we do that, I do like to stabilize the fabric one more time by drawing and stitching before I cut that point off. I do want to leave a minimum of 1/4 inch from this point up, because when you put your binding on, the binding is going to come to this point. But I like to play it a little bit safe and do just a little bit more than 1/4 inch. So I'm going to do a generous 1/4 inch. I'm going to use a ruler that I can see through and make sure that I have a generous 1/4 inch from this point. Once those cutting lines have been drawn, and before I cut them, I'm going to bring it to the machine and do a row of stitching all the way along the edge. So it's about 1/8 of an inch into the body of the quilt. I'm going to do this little row of stitching at a 2. And that small stitching is going to help secure these down, but it's also going to anchor all of these threads. Now that this edge all the way around has been stabilized, we can now cut off this extra. As we trim, we want to make sure that we have no less than 1/4 inch seam allowance. The table runner is now trimmed and ready for binding. That stitching is going to hold all that fabric together, and you can see how it stabilized it so it still is flat and it hasn't stretched any. The binding can be cut and put on in your favorite way. I'm going to start by sewing my binding so that the binding is on the right side. Once it's stitched, it's going to roll over to the back side. Once the binding is ready to go, we need to find an angle on both of these corners. And it needs to be the center of the angles. And there is a very simple way of finding the center of the angles. We're just going to fold our fabric in half. And that fold line is the line that I need. Just fold and iron that with your thumb. And what we're looking to do is to mark a little bit of this fold area. I can see that right down the center. I need to do that to both of these points. The same thing is going to be true for these corners. I need to take these 2 edges and match them up. Make sure that point is right up at the corner. Match up those raw edges. Now I need to mark that fold. That line is going to come right from that point, right through the center. Because of the pattern on this table runner, I will be using a sample so that we can get a really good look on how to do the binding on the corners. I'm going to use this tan color as the quilt and some lovely lime green for the binding. This will definitely show up in the camera. So the sample is treated the same as the table runner. I've marked that center line where I've folded that fabric in half on both corners. Now I'm going to be able to take this to the machine. You can start and stop your binding in your favorite method. But what we're going to do is concentrate on folding these corners. I'll be sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance to put on this binding. Stop somewhere between 1 inch to 2 inches from this corner. I want to transfer that mark to my binding. The mark on the top is the same as the mark on the bottom. I'm going to continue stitching that 1/4 inch seam until I get to the line. And then I'm going to turn the fabric and stitch off of the fabric, going back in the same direction. So it ends up being this little point. Stitch right to that mark. Twist and stitch off. I do not cut the thread, I leave the thread attached. This is going to give me a handle when I do my next row of stitching. All corners are going to be treated the same regardless of the angle. We need to find the center point and transfer it to that binding. We've stopped and have come off. Now we can put a pin and hold the pin down on that angle. From here we can pick this binding up and match the raw edges of the quilt to the raw edges of the binding. And just pick this up and slide it over. You can put a pin if you'd like to hold that down. From here, we just need to fold this little point down. And we're going to fold it down going towards the seam that we already finished. So just give that a finger press and now stitch the next row. A 1/4 inch stitch all the way down. And I'm going to use that thread that I kept on sort of as a handle. The needle and the foot need to get over a little bit of a hump here. And this is just going to help me guide it so that it doesn't try to get pulled in underneath. And just hold this slightly and start stitching. Then I can let that thread go and continue stitching. And I'm going to stitch until I get to 1 inch to 2 inches from this point. Transfer those markings, put the pin just right at the end of the fold, and stitch right to that point, and then go back off. I've come to that point. Now I'm going to stitch off. I'm going to leave that thread so I can have another handle. I already have that pin marked, so now I can take this and just slide it over so that those raw edges are going to match up. When we match up those edges, we must match up this corner. So you're not going to see any of the quilt backing. So we can take this piece and move it forward until we have a nice square edge right there at that fold. Pin if you'd like, and finger press. For this corner, that fold is sitting right along the top edge. And that's because that angle is sharper than this angle. This angle was a smaller, more gentle angle. So it gives us a smaller fold. The more gentle the angle, the smaller the fold. We're going to be able to use this thread and just hold it as a guide. Put your foot down and start stitching. And you're going to be able to just give a little tug, not too hard, to start that stitching. And that's going to help that foot get over that thick edge. And continue back down. That mitered fold is going to line right up to that line. And I've drawn a line on the back, so you can see that it lines up in the back once you fold those two over. For the more gradual corner, you're going to have a smaller little mark. The same stitching has been on the sample, is on that table runner for both that pointier one and that gentle curved corner. We can now turn this around and stitch it to the back. I'll put a link in the description on how to make binding and how to sew on binding. But be sure to use your favorite way of adding your binding on. So by trimming this off to that generous 1/4 inch, we now have beautiful points. Leaving that extra fabric on the edge of the quilt gave us a chance to quilt this and keep it stable so it didn't stretch out of shape with that bias seam. And those 2 rows of stitching, one on each side of the seam, makes a very easy stitch to do. Because we do not have to do any measuring, we just can let the foot follow the seam. And mitering those corners are the same. It's just you're going to have a little miter and a large miter. I'll put a link in the description to the table runner and a video to help with that binding. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.